The house on Lindale Street hadn't changed in decades. It still stood with its fading shutters, creaky porch swing, and stubborn chimney that refused to draw properly on cold mornings. The lawn had grown uneven since the last landscaping, and the mailbox leaned slightly forward, as if tired of holding up so much junk mail. But for Sophie Anderson, that house was sacred ground. It was where she learned to tie her shoes, where her grandmother used to sing to her while baking molasses cookies, and where her grandfather, Theodore Teddy Anderson, had lived quietly for over 40 years after retiring from the rail company. Sophie hadn't intended to move back. Her life was elsewhere: clients, deadlines, the whiplash pace of working in digital publishing in Portland. But things had collapsed quickly. The company folded without warning, her lease ended, and the breakup she thought she'd been processing finally caught up to her. So when the hospital called about Teddy's mild stroke, it felt less like a detour and more like gravity pulling her home. She arrived 2 days after his discharge. The taxi driver didn't help with her bags. He just grunted and sped off, kicking gravel up into the air as she turned to face the house. It looked smaller than she remembered, almost fragile. But the second she opened the door and smelled the musty blend of old wood, furniture polish, and something vaguely citrusy, she was 6 years old again, waiting for cinnamon rolls to cool. Teddy greeted her with a quiet smile. He'd lost weight, and his posture was more hunched than before, but his eyes, those steady, intelligent blue eyes, still sparkled with recognition. He was glad she was home. Though neither of them said it out loud, they settled into a rhythm quickly. Sophie cooked, cleaned, handled the mail, and drove him to checkups. He complained about none of it. If anything, he was embarrassed, always muttering that he didn't want to be a burden. And maybe that's why it took her a week to notice the red flag. It was a small sign, staked into the patchy grass just outside the sidewalk: future site of Brookpine Villas, Modern Senior Living, Est, 2025. Sophie stared at it for a long time, confused. It wasn't on a public lot or construction site. It was planted squarely in her grandfather's front yard. She walked inside and asked Teddy if he knew anything about it. He scratched his temple and said, "Yeah, I think I signed something about that." Just one page. Said they'd take care of some of the sidewalk repairs and fix the gutter next spring. Seemed like a good deal. Sophie's stomach twisted. She asked to see what he signed, and Teddy fumbled through a drawer in the hallway desk before pulling out a crumpled document. No staples, no envelope, just a single piece of paper folded in half. Sophie unfolded it, sat down at the kitchen table, and read it once. Then twice. It wasn't permission for sidewalk work. It was a deed transfer. Full title: voluntary conveyance. $5 compensation. Signature at the bottom: Theodore Anderson. And in small, carefully legal print, the buyer, Stephen Mulroy. The name made her skin crawl. Mulroy had been their next-door neighbor for years, the kind of man who waved with 2 fingers but never really said much. He was cordial, overly neat, and always smelled like faint aftershave. Sophie remembered hearing that he was involved with the local street council, but she never paid much attention until now. She checked the date on the paper. It was signed 3 weeks ago. That was around the time Teddy had been having his dizzy spells before the stroke, when he was more confused than usual. Sophie didn't yell or cry. Instead, she took the document into the living room and read it aloud to Teddy. He sat with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped together, watching her quietly. When she finished, he let out a soft breath and shook his head. "Well, hell," he murmured. "That's not what he told me." "What exactly did he tell you, Grandpa?" Sophie asked, keeping her voice steady. That it was just about letting them spruce up the place a bit, make it more in line with the rest of the neighborhood. Said it was a formality, that it wouldn't change anything important. "And you didn't think to ask anyone about it?" He looked ashamed. "Your grandma handled that stuff." "I never liked paperwork." Sophie didn't respond. Her thoughts were a storm of implications. If the house was sold, who owned it now? Was there any way to reverse it? Why $5? Why Mulroy? And most importantly, was this even legal? She spent the rest of the day combing through paperwork. Utility bills, old insurance letters, property tax receipts, everything was under her grandfather's name. There was no mortgage left, the house had been paid off 15 years ago. And yet legally it now belonged to someone else. Her next step was to check with the county clerk's office, where a polite but disinterested clerk confirmed what the paper already said. The property had been transferred. It was official. On paper, Teddy didn't own his own home anymore. Sophie drove home in silence. She didn't turn on the radio. Her hands were clenched so tightly around the steering wheel that her knuckles turned white. She had expected some red tape, maybe a misunderstanding. Not this. Not a fully executed sale for the cost of a sandwich. By the time she pulled into the driveway, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the lawn. The little sign advertising Brookpine Villas seemed to mock her from its corner post. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the faint wheeze of her grandfather's breathing from the next room and thinking about what could happen if they were forced out. Where would he go? What would they do? And more pressingly, how could someone like Mulroy legally take advantage of a man who could barely remember what day it was? The next morning, Sophie knocked on Mulroy's door. He answered promptly, dressed in a crisp polo shirt and beige slacks, as if expecting her. He smiled warm, rehearsed, and hollow. "Miss Anderson," he said, "what can I do for you?" "I'd like to talk about the deed transfer you had my grandfather sign." His smile never faltered. "Of course. Everything was done properly. You're welcome to review the documents if you like." She bit her tongue. "You told him it was about sidewalk repairs." "I told him," he said smoothly, "that we're working on a neighborhood improvement project and that his participation would help speed things along." Which is true. The transfer was voluntary. He signed without coercion. You gave him $5. He accepted it. "There's a record of payment." Sophie stared at him. "You took advantage of a man recovering from a stroke." Mulroy tilted his head slightly. "With all due respect, if there were any cognitive concerns, perhaps they should have been documented at the time." That's when she knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a setup. Legal, perhaps, but predatory by design. He knew Teddy wouldn't question the paperwork. Knew no one was around to stop it. Knew the house was paid off and ripe for acquisition. And most chillingly, he knew that once the paper was signed, undoing it would be next to impossible. Sophie returned home and did what any rational person would do. She made phone calls. Not to the police, but to elder advocacy groups, to the county ombudsman, to the Office of Adult Protective Services. She began pulling thread after thread, building a timeline, and gathering whatever documentation she could find. If there was even a sliver of a chance this deal could be overturned, she was going to find it. Because this wasn't just about a house. This was about taking advantage of someone too trusting to know better. And she wasn't going to let it stand. Sophie didn't waste time with panic. It was a luxury she couldn't afford, not with the weight of a fraudulent sale hanging over her family's head. Instead, she got organized. The morning after her confrontation with Mulroy, she opened Teddy's old filing cabinet and began sorting through everything: old wills, outdated medical records, utilities, scraps of correspondence. She was searching for anything that could establish a timeline of her grandfather's cognitive decline. If there was going to be any chance of undoing this transaction, it would have to come down to competency, whether Teddy was mentally capable of understanding what he signed, and more importantly, whether the person presenting the document had reason to suspect otherwise. She found a note from Teddy's primary care physician from 3 months earlier, a scribbled update about short-term memory fluctuations, and a referral to a neurologist, which Teddy, naturally had ignored. Sophie called the doctor and explained the situation, asking if he would be willing to provide a formal statement about Teddy's cognitive health. The doctor agreed, cautiously, and scheduled a new evaluation for the end of the week. That would be their first anchor. She needed more. The next step was the county land records office. Sophie spent hours at the clerk's terminal, scanning documents and looking for patterns. What she found was more disturbing than she expected. Over the past year, a series of rapid-fire property transfers had taken place on their Street 5 homes, all owned by elderly residents. It sold for suspiciously low prices to one of 3 different LLCs. The names of the buyers were different, but the mailing addresses for the entities all pointed back to the same P.O. box downtown. And the contact listed on each transaction? Stephen Mulroy. He hadn't just done this once. He'd made a system out of it. Target the elderly, approach them under the guise of neighborhood improvement, offer assistance, get them to sign. The values of the sales were insulting. One home went for $10 and a lawn care rebate. Another listed a transaction fee of $0 in exchange for future considerations. This was no longer just about Teddy. This was a pattern of exploitation hiding in plain sight. Sophie printed every file, every deed, every transfer record. She cross-referenced addresses and looked up voter registrations. 3 of the previous homeowners were now listed in assisted living facilities. 1 had passed away. The 4th, a woman named Margot Evans, now living with her daughter in New Hampshire. Sophie found her number and made the call. Margot, 82, sounded tired but clear-headed. When Sophie explained what had happened with her grandfather, there was a long pause, followed by a bitter laugh. "He got you too?" Margot said. "That bastard told me the same thing, said they were rezoning, and if I didn't sign, I'd have to pay for the sidewalk repairs myself. I didn't want trouble. I didn't know what else to do." Sophie asked if she would be willing to give a statement. Margot hesitated, then said, "I've got nothing left to lose. Just tell me where to send it." That night, Sophie laid everything out on the dining room table like a war map: Teddy's deed, Margot's story, the county transfer records. She took photos, made digital copies, uploaded them into folders, and labeled them meticulously. The more she uncovered, the colder she became. This wasn't just a real estate hustle. This was a form of institutional gaslighting, carefully calibrated to extract homes from those least capable of fighting back. Mulroy had found a perfect storm: elderly homeowners, isolated from family, accustomed to deference, and raised to avoid confrontation. All he had to do was smile, speak in euphemisms, and slide a single piece of paper across the table. The problem was, now Sophie was in the picture, and she didn't do euphemisms. The first real wall she hit came from the legal side. She reached out to 3 attorneys specializing in elder law. The first charged a $300 consultation fee and told her she had an uphill battle. The second refused to speak without seeing full medical evaluations and documentation of coercion. The third listened, paused, then asked, "Do you have proof he was mentally unfit on the exact day he signed it?" Sophie admitted she didn't. "Not yet," and he said, "Then you'll need more than sympathy. You'll need a smoking gun." That phrase stuck in her mind. Later that week, during a routine trash pickup, Sophie noticed something odd: a shredded piece of paper in the recycle bin behind Mulroy's house. It was barely legible, but her eyes caught fragments of a neighborhood upgrade plan. With hand-marked notes, phases, lot numbers, scheduled demolitions. Her grandfather's lot was listed in Phase 1. It wasn't proof, but it was intent. And intent mattered. Sophie returned to her car and sat there, her pulse loud in her ears. She was a rational person. She didn't believe in conspiracies or paranoia, but she believed in pressure, and this looked like an orchestrated squeeze. The fact that there was an actual timeline for demolishing a home that wasn't even officially vacated yet, before any permits had been posted, was not just ambitious, it was incriminating. Back home, she called the Adult Protective Services hotline. The caseworker, a woman named Elise, sounded competent and unfazed, as if this wasn't the first time she'd heard something like this. Sophie described the situation, outlined the document, explained the deception. Elise asked for copies of the deed and Teddy's medical records. Sophie sent them over. Elise said they would begin an investigation into financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. It was the first sliver of hope Sophie had felt in days. She told Teddy what was happening in gentle, deliberate terms. He seemed confused at first, ashamed that he might have made a mistake, but Sophie reassured him. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. "You trusted someone who misled you. That's on them." Teddy nodded slowly, then said, "Your grandma would have caught it." Sophie smiled and squeezed his hand. "She would have burned his house down," she muttered. Teddy chuckled. "She would have at least stolen his lawn chairs." 3 days later, Sophie received a thick envelope in the mail. It was from a law office representing Mulroy. Inside were printed copies of the deed transfer, a formal demand that they vacate the premises within 30 days, and a clause stating that any interference with future construction would be met with civil litigation. It was dressed in legalese but soaked in intimidation. Sophie didn't show it to Teddy. Instead, she called Elise at APS and forwarded the document. Elise's reply was short, "Don't do anything. We're escalating this." The following morning, a white SUV with tinted windows parked across the street from their house. It didn't move for hours. Nobody got out. Sophie watched from the window, her phone in hand, but didn't call the police. It wasn't illegal to sit on a public street, but it was unsettling. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The SUV didn't move for 2 days. It parked across the street in the morning and left after dark, engine silent, windows up, license plate partially obscured by dirt. Sophie took photos, logged the time, and reported it to Elise, who promised to include the behavior in her report. But the message was clear without words: pressure. Pressure to back off, pressure to feel watched, pressure to give up. It didn't work. If anything, it made Sophie colder, more methodical. She began locking the doors during the day. She rerouted Teddy's medical appointments through a rideshare service so she could work uninterrupted. She wasn't just reacting, now she was preparing. The next move came less subtly. A bright orange tag was nailed to the front door one afternoon while she was out buying groceries. Notice of utility inspection, unsecured premises. It bore a forged signature and a phone number that rang into a looped recording. When she called the actual utility company, they confirmed no such inspection had been scheduled. A day later, the water pressure dropped to a trickle. Sophie drove to the municipal office and filed a complaint. The clerk shrugged, said there were updates being done to the line servicing their block. Coincidence, maybe, but the timing reeked. Teddy, for his part, was trying not to notice the tension. He pretended to nap more often, claimed he liked eating in the garage because it was cooler there, and began asking questions he already knew the answers to, which Sophie knew was his way of keeping some dignity. She played along, but inside she was tightening like a wire. The pressure wasn't just logistical now, it was psychological. And it was working on him. He began to withdraw. He spoke less. He stopped reading the newspaper. One night, she caught him looking at old photo albums in the dark, his hands shaking. He whispered, "I think your grandma would be ashamed of me." Sophie sat beside him and said, "No, Grandpa, she'd be ashamed of them." The next morning, Elise called. APS had opened an official investigation. A social worker would be visiting the house within 72 hours. They needed statements, documentation, a cognitive evaluation. Sophie confirmed the neurologist appointment was scheduled. Elise seemed encouraged. "This is the start," she said. "These things take time, but once it's open, it's on record. It's real." That same afternoon, a man in a reflective vest showed up at the property line. He didn't knock. He stood in the yard with a clipboard, writing something. Sophie walked out and asked who he was. He said he was with the Community Infrastructure Board. She asked for ID. He hesitated, then mumbled that he left it in the truck. She asked again. He turned and walked off without answering. She followed him far enough to see him get into a pickup with no plates. That night, Teddy had a panic attack. He came into Sophie's room at 2 in the morning, disoriented and sweating. He thought the house was on fire. It wasn't. But something had triggered him, perhaps the stress, the strange cars, the changes he couldn't quite grasp. Sophie called his doctor, who recommended a short-term sedative and stress reduction. She didn't say it aloud, but she knew the pressure was making him worse. Sophie spent the next day consulting with a real estate attorney, finally someone willing to help. His name was Dan Hurley, mid-50s, a former city planner turned lawyer. He looked at the documents Sophie had gathered and said, "This is technically legal, but it smells like fraud." He agreed to take the case and immediately filed a notice of interest on the deed, which would at least pause any pending transfer or resale. He also sent a cease and desist letter to Mulroy's attorney regarding harassment and unauthorized contact. "You won't stop them by yelling," Dan said. "You'll stop them by slowing them down." On day 3, the pressure escalated again. Someone filed a complaint to the neighborhood association claiming Sophie was operating an unauthorized adult care facility out of the home. It was nonsense, but it triggered a mandatory inspection from the local zoning board. When Sophie opened the door to the inspector, he looked apologetic. "We have to follow up on all reports." Someone filed anonymously. He stayed 10 minutes, looked around, and left without comment. But it added another brick to the wall of fatigue she was up against. She couldn't do it all herself. So she called her Aunt Linda in Ohio, Teddy's younger sister, and explained everything. Linda, tough, blunt, and unafraid of confrontation, arrived the next evening with a suitcase and a metal box of family documents. "You should have called me sooner," she said, hugging Teddy hard. "He's my brother too." Linda began helping with meals, sorting paperwork, and calling old neighbors for statements. Her presence changed the energy in the house. Sophie could breathe again, even if only a little. The day after Linda arrived, something unexpected happened. Mulroy knocked on the door. He wore the same beige slacks, a pastel dress shirt, and that expression half smile, half mask. Sophie answered. Linda stood behind her. "I just wanted to see if we could find a way forward," Mulroy said, his voice smooth. "It's unfortunate. What's happened? The misunderstanding. I'd hate to see this become litigious." Sophie didn't blink. "It already is," she said. Mulroy's smile cracked just slightly. "Litigation can be exhausting," he said. "Costly. Time-consuming. Your grandfather's not getting any younger." Linda stepped forward and said, "You'll leave now or I'll call the cops." Mulroy held up his hands, turned, and walked away. But as he did, Sophie noticed something in his hand, a small remote, black, with a blinking red light. It was gone before she could say anything. Later that week, Teddy passed his cognitive evaluation. Barely. The neurologist wrote that, while he showed signs of mild impairment, he was clearly unable to grasp the implications of a property transfer, particularly one of that size. Elise from APS added the evaluation to the investigation file. Dan filed for a temporary injunction on any development plans for the lot. It was granted. For now, the property was frozen. But Sophie knew this wasn't a win. It was a delay, a breathing space. The kind of space predators use to change tactics. They'd come again, differently. She had to be ready. She ordered outdoor security cameras, had a locksmith rekey every door, installed motion lights. She wasn't paranoid, she was learning, and she was far from done. The middle of the battle came not with a bang, but with a thick envelope dropped at the front door in the late afternoon, stamped with the county's official seal. Inside were maps, zoning documents, and a notice. The neighborhood committee had approved a reclassification for several residential parcels, including but not limited to Lot 8A, which was Teddy's house. The reclassification wasn't immediate, it was pending final review, but once completed, it would give developers broader authority over design, utility access, and usage, especially for lots already under transition. Sophie stared at the language. parsing every line twice. Now it was clear Mulroy and his associates weren't just targeting single homes. They were laying the foundation quietly, bureaucratically, for a larger transformation of the neighborhood. These papers weren't just forms. They were evidence that everything was already in motion, and Teddy's house was the first domino in a long row waiting to fall. Sophie took the documents to Dan Hurley, who read them slowly in his office, his brow furrowing with each page. "They're setting up a corridor," he said finally, "probably to connect two commercial zones. That would make this land incredibly valuable to their buyers. If your grandfather's house stays, it throws the alignment off, makes the project legally lopsided." Sophie felt her jaw tighten. "So we're the kink in their blueprint." Dan nodded. "The problem is they're patient, and they know how to wait people out. You're fighting not just a man, but a timeline backed by capital. And you're on the clock." That night, Linda took out an old manila envelope she had brought from Ohio. Inside were copies of letters, decades-old correspondence between their grandfather and the original land developer, handwritten notes about easements, agreements from the 1970s that stated the property was non-transferable by proxy without consent of living familial beneficiaries. Sophie's heart raced. If the language was valid and still legally binding, it might mean that the deed transfer required her or Linda's signature to be enforceable. It was a thin thread, but one worth pulling. Dan reviewed the materials the next morning and said the language could complicate things. At the very least, it muddies the water. And when developers see mud, they pause. They don't like unpredictability. Sophie wasn't alone anymore. She and Linda began to move like a team. They cataloged every document, contacted the original surveying firm to retrieve any blueprints or easement maps, and asked Dan to file a secondary notice of contestation. Meanwhile, the APS investigation progressed slowly. Elise updated them regularly, though nothing had come down yet in writing. Teddy was declining emotionally, if not cognitively. Some mornings he seemed lucid and sharp, remembering the names of people they hadn't seen in years. Other days he seemed lost, disoriented in his own living room, mistaking Sophie for his late wife, or forgetting why he had come into the kitchen. It broke her heart, but she didn't show it. She just kept moving forward, knowing he was the reason she was fighting at all. Then, without warning, a realtor appeared in the neighborhood. She didn't approach the house. She stood across the street with a client, gesturing toward Teddy's property as if it were already on the market. Sophie stepped outside and watched them silently. The realtor eventually turned, locked eyes with her, and smiled cold, professional, impersonal. Sophie said nothing. That night, she called Dan and asked if it was possible the house had been listed without their knowledge. He checked the next morning and confirmed it hadn't yet, but the intention was clear. The listing would go live as soon as the reclassification passed and the injunction expired. Sophie understood now that the other side wasn't trying to win in court. They were trying to wait them out. Paperwork, delays, threats, emotional fatigue, this was a siege, not a battle. And then, a shift. Dan called unexpectedly one evening with a tone Sophie hadn't heard from him before, excited, cautious, and sharp. "I think we have something," he said. "One of the developers on this project used to work for the city. He never filed a disclosure when he transitioned into the private sector. That's a violation. It could invalidate portions of the zoning application." Sophie didn't fully understand the implications, but she didn't need to. She trusted Dan, and more importantly, she trusted leverage. Dan reached out to a former colleague in the Ethics Oversight Committee and filed a quiet challenge, not public, not official, but enough to freeze the zoning board's decision pending internal review. Within a week, the realtor disappeared. The zoning meeting was postponed, and for the first time since this began, the silence felt like retreat, not suppression. Sophie didn't celebrate. She simply sat on the porch that night with a mug of tea and watched the street grow quiet. Teddy sat beside her, wrapped in a blanket, his gaze soft and distant. You remember when we built that birdhouse? He asked suddenly. Sophie turned to him. I do, I was 6. You let me hammer the nails crooked. He laughed gently. You thought the birds would care if the windows were uneven. Sophie smiled. They never complained. He leaned back in the chair, eyes closing. That house, it was always supposed to be for you. Sophie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Something had changed. The other side blinked. And now Sophie knew it was her turn to press. The temporary silence that followed the postponed zoning meeting was not peace, it was recalibration. Sophie felt it in the way the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, the subtle retraction of pressure as if her opponents had withdrawn a few steps not out of defeat, but to revise their approach. The cameras outside still recorded every passerby. The utility glitches had stopped, but the mailbox was now filled daily with unfamiliar flyers advertising assisted living, estate planning seminars, and cash for home services. There was an edge to everything, a background hum of tension that never faded. Sophie kept working. With Dan managing the legal front and Elise continuing the APS inquiry, she and Linda focused on protecting what little normalcy they could salvage for Teddy, whose cognitive swings were growing more pronounced. Some mornings he remembered what time it was and which room the coffee maker lived in. Other days he asked where his wife had gone and seemed surprised when Sophie answered. It was these days that made the fight harder when she saw the weight on him, the confusion and shame he couldn't quite name but clearly felt. Then, one Wednesday morning, the next strike came, sudden and bold. A letter arrived not from Mulroy's legal team or the zoning board, but from the Department of Code Enforcement. It alleged that several modifications made to the home were not in compliance with modern safety ordinances. The accusations were vague: electrical inconsistencies, improper gutter alignment, unclear structural records on the shed in the backyard. The notice included a 30-day order to remedy the violations or face daily fines. Sophie brought the letter to Dan, who examined it with a scowl. "This is pressure dressed up as policy," he said. "They're coming through the back door now, trying to push you out by cost and code." He filed an immediate appeal, but that didn't stop the inspections. Within a week, city workers arrived with clipboards and high-visibility vests, snapping photos, measuring downspouts, marking cracks in the driveway with neon spray paint. Sophie tried to speak to them, but they refused to engage, citing only routine enforcement procedures. The house now looked less like a home and more like a crime scene under review. That same week, Teddy's primary care doctor received an unexpected visit from a medical review consultant asking about his capacity, his medications, and whether there had been any recent concerns of abuse or neglect. Sophie only found out when the doctor called her, alarmed, asking why Adult Protective Services had escalated the inquiry into a formal capacity hearing. Sophie was stunned it hadn't. Elise confirmed this. There had been no such request from APS. Someone else had filed under a pseudonym, likely in an attempt to challenge the legitimacy of Teddy's ongoing residence in the house. It was subtle, surgical, and vile. Elise, furious, escalated the case to a supervisory level and submitted a request to flag further interference as retaliatory conduct. But damage had already been done. Teddy was now officially marked for evaluation in a system not known for speed or mercy. The worst part was watching his response. When he received a letter informing him of the scheduled assessment, he didn't argue. He just stared at it and asked if he'd be allowed to stay if he passed. Sophie knelt in front of him and said, "You're not going anywhere." But the question lingered in the room like smoke. Meanwhile, Linda uncovered something unexpected. While going through a box of old tax documents, she found an envelope marked Architectural Survey, 1976. Inside were hand-drawn maps of the property, complete with original fencing lines, landscaping plans, and most notably a notation about a sealed well beneath the back corner of the lot. Sophie remembered the well vaguely from childhood, a thing once visible and later bricked over. What caught her eye was a side note: private groundwater access, not municipal dependent. Dan reviewed the document and raised an eyebrow. If that's active and independently certified, it changes utility classification status. It could mean your property doesn't rely on city services, which would make enforcement based on those services much more complicated. It was an obscure angle, but potentially powerful. Sophie hired an environmental consultant to test the well. 2 days later, the man returned with results. Viable water source, unregistered in recent municipal records, and untouched for over 30 years. They'd struck something minor but legally interesting. Before they could act on it, the front window was shattered. It happened at 2:42 a.m. Cameras captured nothing someone had approached from the blind spot between the house and the tree line. A brick wrapped in plastic landed inside the living room, cracking the frame of an old photo of Teddy and his wife. No note, no signature, no witnesses. The police filed a report and left. No patrols were assigned. No follow-up. Dan advised them to document everything but not retaliate. They want you reactive, he warned. Stay disciplined. Sophie had barely finished sweeping up the glass when a neighbor came over Mr. Barrington, from 2 doors down, a quiet man in his 70s who had kept his distance through most of the conflict. He looked exhausted, shoulders sagging under some invisible weight. "I heard the noise," he said, eyes downcast. "Listen, I've got something you might want to see." Inside his house, in a drawer beneath an old coffee maker, was a folded letter, a copy of a contract he'd been offered by Mulroy nearly 6 months earlier. It was similar in language to the one Teddy had signed, but Barrington had refused. He'd held on to it, just in case. He said if I didn't want to sign, that was fine. But he said things might start getting more difficult around here. Sophie thanked him and asked if he'd be willing to make a formal statement. He nodded. "I should have done it sooner," he said. Dan added the new document to their growing file and submitted it to the Ethics Review Board alongside the earlier violations. The case was now no longer a single dispute, it was evidence of a pattern. Elise's supervisors approved a full forensic review of the transactions initiated by Mulroy and his affiliates. Dan also filed a petition to freeze any code enforcement penalties until the APS case concluded. Progress. Marginal, but forward. But Mulroy had one more play. Within days of the window incident, a for sale sign appeared on Teddy's lawn. Sophie came home from an errand and found it staked into the ground, bold red letters declaring opportunity lot, act fast, with a phone number below. She ripped it from the ground and threw it across the street, but it didn't matter. The message was clear: this house, your house, is already gone in our heads. The battle now wasn't just legal or procedural. It was psychological war, and the only way to survive it was to keep pressing harder, louder, smarter. Sophie walked back inside, stood over the spot where the brick had landed, and opened her laptop. She wasn't backing down. The weeks leading into the court hearing unfolded like a tightening vice, each day bringing some small signal that the other side wasn't giving up, just shifting their strategy. Sophie could feel it in the silence between steps, in the delayed callbacks, in the way the same white CSU would sometimes roll by in the afternoon and idle at the intersection for 10 minutes before moving on. The temporary pause in official harassment did not mean retreat, it meant recalibration. Dan Hurley worked around the clock, assembling a case that didn't rely on sentiment but on technical violations, on legal friction, on precedent. APS, now fully engaged and backed by statements from 3 additional residents who admitted they too had been approached with simplified deed transfers, was preparing its own internal report. What had started as a neighborly misunderstanding was now shaping into something that resembled systemic abuse of trust. Still, nothing was certain. The reclassification plan hadn't been dropped, only stalled. The code violations were on hold, not dismissed. Teddy's capacity hearing had been postponed after Sophie and Dan presented conflicting evaluations, but it remained open, pending further documentation. They had momentum, but no closure. And then came the hearing. It was held in a gray building downtown, the kind with bland carpeting and clocks that ran 5 minutes behind. The judge, an older man with a steady voice and no patience for theatrics, reviewed the paperwork quietly for nearly 20 minutes before allowing arguments to begin. Mulroy's attorneys spoke first. Their approach was predictably sterile. The deed was signed voluntarily. No evidence of duress. Monetary compensation was accepted. The transfer had been recorded legally and in accordance with property law. Sophie sat in the back with Teddy and Linda, her fingers clenched in her lap. She had heard it all before, but in that courtroom it sounded colder, more official, like a verdict already written. Dan stood and spoke with precision. He didn't shout. He didn't moralize. He laid out a sequence of actions, dates, patterns. He presented testimony from residents. He introduced the old land use maps. He cited the missing disclosures from former city officials turned developers. He didn't accuse. He revealed. And then, at just the right moment, he introduced the letter Sophie had received from code enforcement, alongside the documentation of the forged inspection notice. He didn't say who had sent it. He simply asked the court to consider whether a developer, benefiting from such repeated errors, might be encouraging them more actively than they admitted. The judge listened, nodding occasionally. Then he looked at Teddy, who had been silent the entire time. "Mr. Anderson," he said, "do you understand what is happening here?" Teddy stood, legs stiff, voice shaking slightly. "I think so, Your Honor. I signed something I didn't fully understand. I thought I was agreeing to fix the sidewalk. And did anyone explain otherwise?" the judge asked. "No," Teddy said. "No one said it meant giving up my house." The room was silent. Mulroy's attorneys didn't object. There was nothing to object to. After a recess, the judge returned with a temporary ruling. The deed transfer was suspended pending further review. The house could not be listed, altered, or developed. Any attempts to enforce the prior agreement would be considered coercive under the current APES investigation. And most importantly, all properties transferred to associated LLCs within the last 12 months were to be placed under review by the Ethics Oversight Committee. Sophie felt her breath release like a collapsing dam, but the fight wasn't over. The next day, Mulroy filed a motion to appeal the injunction, this time under the argument that the delay would cause irreparable financial harm to his development timeline. Dan anticipated it. He filed a counterclaim accusing the LLC of suppressing information relevant to public zoning impact. The war had moved from the street into the courts, slower, colder, but no less dangerous. 3 days later, Sophie arrived home to find Teddy sitting in the driveway. He was holding the for sale sign Mulroy had planted, broken into 2 pieces, staring at it like it was something foreign. She sat beside him on the concrete, not saying a word. After a long silence, he whispered, "I almost let them take everything." Sophie looked at him, her voice calm. "You didn't let them. They tried to take it. And we're still here." That night, a letter came from APs. The official report had been completed and submitted to the state. It concluded that the transaction between Teddy Anderson and the buyer had been conducted without sufficient safeguards for his cognitive condition, constituted undue influence, and bore signs of deceptive inducement. While not criminal, the behavior warranted administrative response and referred several involved parties for investigation. It wasn't an arrest. It wasn't headlines. But it was institutional acknowledgement. That was a weapon. Dan called the next morning, his voice triumphant. "We've got leverage," he said. "They'll keep pushing, but this shifts the center of gravity. Now it's their project under scrutiny, not your family." The appeal hearing was scheduled for the following month. Sophie knew better than to relax, but for the first time she didn't feel like she was reacting. She was on offense. She spent the weekend boxing up old documents, storing fragile items, preparing for the long haul. She didn't know how many more hearings, how many more letters, how many more nights staring at shadows from the streetlight, but she knew she wasn't backing down. Not now, not after what they'd been through. Teddy walked into the room while she was labeling a storage box and said, "You know, your grandma would have hated all this." Sophie smiled. She would have set their office on fire. Teddy laughed. She would have started with their garden. And for the first time in weeks, Sophie laughed too. 3 months after the judge's injunction, the street looked the same, but everything had changed. The for sale signs were gone, the mysterious SUV stopped appearing, and the flyers in the mailbox returned to mundane coupons for carpet cleaning and 2-for-1 pizza. The tension that had once gripped the neighborhood had dissipated, replaced by a wary stillness, like a town recovering from a long siege. Sophie no longer woke up, expecting a new threat. The mailbox no longer brought dread. The phone, when it rang, did so without causing her pulse to spike. Most importantly, Teddy was still in his home, still in his chair by the window, and though his days continued to swing between clarity and fog, the fear that had haunted his face during those worst weeks was gone. The fight was over, and they had won not through rage, not through spectacle, but through persistence, strategy, and refusing to be pushed quietly out of the way. The appeal had been dismissed. The state's ethics committee completed its review and issued a formal reprimand to the developer connected to the case, citing multiple breaches of transparency and failure to disclose conflicts of interest. Mulroy resigned from his position on the neighborhood committee and sold his home, quietly, without ceremony, but to a private buyer who removed the security cameras and let the lawn grow wild for the first time in years. Several of the LLCs connected to the fraudulent transfers were dissolved in a single week, likely under legal pressure. APS closed their investigation with a full written acknowledgement that Teddy's rights had been compromised and protections had failed him. The county recorded the reversal of the deed transfer, reestablishing Teddy Anderson as the sole and rightful owner of the property at 811 Lindale Street. No more caveats, no more asterisks, no more loopholes. Sophie requested and received a certified copy of the deed, framed it, and hung it above the fireplace, proof, visible and irrefutable, that the house belonged to the man who built it and the family who defended it. Dan Hurley refused payment for the final month of his work. He said he'd seen too many cases like this spiral into silence and wanted this one to be the one that stuck. Sophie sent him a bottle of good bourbon and a thank you card signed by Teddy in his still steady hand. Linda returned to Ohio but promised to come back every summer, and true to her word, the following June she arrived with a toolbox, a box of dusty photo albums, and a determination to repaint the porch swing. Sophie stayed. She turned down a remote position in Portland and instead took a community advocacy job in the same county where the battle had unfolded. She began working with a local task force that had emerged from the APS findings, helping design new procedural guidelines for property transactions involving vulnerable adults. She didn't want the spotlight. She didn't want revenge. She wanted safeguards, paper trails, waiting periods, required second signatures. Nothing radical. Just accountability. The neighborhood changed slowly in response. More families started asking questions, getting involved, attending the dull zoning meetings that no one had ever bothered with before. A new community board formed, not appointed, but elected, and Sophie was asked to join. She declined, but she helped them draft their charter. She didn't need a title. She had her name on the mailbox, her grandfather in the living room, and her grandmother's rosebush still blooming stubbornly in the side yard. On a mild October afternoon, Sophie and Teddy sat on the back porch, watching the leaves drift down in slow, thoughtful spirals. He was lucid that day, alert and quieter than usual. He turned to her after a long silence and said, "You could have walked away. I wouldn't have blamed you." Sophie shook her head. "You never walked away from us." "I wasn't about to start the trend." He smiled, his eyes wet but steady. "I don't remember everything, but I know you kept me here." She reached over, squeezed his hand, and said, "You were never leaving. You just forgot that for a little while." That night, she walked past the fireplace and paused in front of the framed deed. For the first time, it felt settled. Not just legally, but emotionally. The house didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like what it had always been beneath the fear and paperwork. Home,